And we're very pleased to have with us today Ali Al-Za'tari, the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in the Syrian Arab Republic. Mr. Za'tari, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the UN media giving me the chance to speak. I think you know the complexities of the situation in Syria, and I can, of course, and will recite some of the numbers and the figures that we have. But I'd rather that I speak less and have a discussion than make a long presentation. But just let me emphasize that we have between 12 to 13 million people in need in a humanitarian sense, that we don't think that the humanitarian crisis in Syria is going to phase out in 2019, and it could probably cross into 2020 and future years. We have 6.2 million internally displaced people within Syria. They concentrate in Aleppo and rural Damascus Governorate and Idlib. We have close to 1.2 million movements of people this year, which means that you may have a person who has moved more than once during the year. We have close to 1 million returnees, but these are mostly internally displaced people who went back to their homes and houses, much less refugees who have returned. We're in a 2018 humanitarian response plan implementation, where we've asked for $3.4 billion for Syria, and we've received close to 45% of that, or 1.5 billion. The team in Syria covers almost 14 UN agencies seated in Damascus, and a comparable number of them outside. We work throughout Syria. The only place where the UN personnel don't operate from is Idlib, where we work from Turkey through cross-border operations. But we have teams in most cities and governorates of Syria. The worries that we have are to take us into 2019 with some clarity as to numbers of those who are in need in Syria. Our assistance is needs-based. Therefore, we need to target those who are in need of humanitarian assistance. To do that, we need to carry out factual assessments by the entire sectors that we have, health, water and sanitation, protection, early recovery, etc., education. And of course, have comparable freer access to areas where we need to be to do the assessments and to deliver the assistance. And finally, to generate enough resources to meet the demand of those people in need. Let me just highlight that with all of the Syrian IDPs and Syrian refugees outside, Syria is still home to refugees from Palestine and from Iraq and from Sudan. Indeed, the number of Palestinian refugees has decreased by almost 150,000 or so who have left. They're still being served in a gallant way by UNRWA, which is facing a lot of financial difficulties nowadays. And they are part and parcel of the humanitarian response in Syria. In our appeal and access and work with the people in Syria, we appeal to all people all over Syria under any flag of authority or a control mechanism. It's our duty to do that. So let me stop here and take your questions.
All right. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the briefing. My name is Betül Ülük with the Turkish news agency Anadolu. Last week, the Syrian foreign minister during the general debate said that the country was ready for the voluntary return of the refugees. My question is, do you believe that the country is safe and secure enough for the refugees to return? And a UN official had told us that it would take about 50 years for the reconstruction or to build Syria. Do you agree with that? How long would it take to rebuild the country?
Let me take the second question because it's easier. I have no idea if it will take 30 or 50 years. That is something that is governed by capacities and funding, and it's difficult to answer, really. On the refugees returning, this is the position of the government. We in the UN believe that refugees need to make their own decisions in a voluntary way to assess the situation for themselves before making a decision to come back to Syria. On the face of it, some areas in Syria will look to the onlooker as safe and recipient. There are people living in Syria, as you know, in all cities. But a refugee has to have a feeling of safety and security, a way to lead a living back in Syria, and a roof. We are not telling refugees to come into Syria. We're not telling them not to come into Syria. The minute they cross into Syria and we have access to them, we will be providing assistance based on their needs, as assessed by us. So the position of the UN is we're not encouraging Syrians to come back, but if they cross and when they cross and we can have access to them, we will be assisting them.
Well, if I may follow up on that. You said some areas were recipient. If you could tell us which areas they are.
The major towns are basically in that category. I mean, Damascus and the environs of Damascus, Latakia, Tartus, Homs, even Hama, parts of Aleppo, for instance, where you have seen IDPs returning and back into life the way they like it to be. It's really a personal decision for a refugee to make. In my view, it's safety and security first, if they feel safe and secure to come back. And then the rest is a comparison between a status outside and a status inside. It will have to be a decision of the Syrian refugee, him or herself.
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you so much for this briefing. I have a follow-up on the same question, then I have a separate question. Has the Syrian government communicated to OCHA, to the United Nations, about restrictions of who can return to Syria and who can't? And what is the United Nations position about that? If there are people that the Syrian government would not like to be returned to the country. And my second question is about Afrin, if you give us an update about what's going on in Afrin area, and is it one of those areas that people are supposed to be safe to be returned to? Thank you.
In answer to the first question, no, the government has not communicated to OCHA or to me on restrictions that they have on who returns. So they have not communicated, therefore I have no reaction to that.
Are they open to all refugees to return? Did they say that?
That's what the foreign minister indicated in his statement, and that's what the government officials tell us, that Syria is open for refugees, Syrian refugees, to come back. On Afrin, I hope that the situation improves. We don't have access to Afrin from inside Syria. The access is from Turkey. We've heard that there are hardships in terms of health and education issues there. As you know, almost 150,000 people left Afrin and are now dispersed in the area northern of Aleppo, Tel Rifat very specifically, in different camps where they are catered for in terms of assistance by the UN, implementing partners, NGOs, the Red Crescent, and Kurdish organizations as well.
Are they allowed to return to Afrin?
I'm not sure that they are allowed to return in that number. Now, some families I heard have tried to return to Afrin, but I cannot say for sure if they were allowed back or not.
Let's just one more. Who's preventing them? Do you know who's preventing them from returning to Afrin?
The area is abuzz with activity and different groups. So it's people again are in the same boat of wanting to feel secure before returning. So that comparison needs to be kept in mind.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to know, you are facing such a daunting budget shortfall. Do you have any idea where is this $4.1 billion shortfall ever going to meet? Has the international community, do you think the international community will come forward to, address this issue? And while that is happening, the refugees keep on multiplying and they're going to big numbers. Can you please give us that number as to what a huge number of refugees have come up with? Thank you.
The funding, of course, we always ask for additional funding because the catastrophe or the crisis is huge. As of today, we have 1.5 billion, which is close to 45%, and we're early October, so there's still 3 months in the year. And I think we will have additional funding from the donor community, which has been generous in terms of contributing to the humanitarian crisis relief in Syria. Now, of course, we would like to receive additional funding, but that additional funding will need to depend on a factual assessment of data and figures and numbers and needs. And to do that, we need to have good access into the different communities in Syria, whether under the Syrian flag or under other flags in Syria. And I think if we manage to obtain that kind of verifiable and defensible data, we will be able to convince the donors that 2019 is going to focus on those who are mostly in need. As far as the refugees, I haven't heard of another Syrian influx of refugees recently. I think the number still hovers in the 5 million point something between Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and the ones that have made it into Europe or overseas.
Thank you. Farnaz Fasih from the Wall Street Journal. I was wondering if you could give us a breakdown of the humanitarian aid. Is it mostly health or education or food that they need going forward? And also, do you think the threat for an Idlib offensive has passed in terms of operational planning? Are you still operating as if there might be a threat to invading Idlib, or how?
I'm making a habit of answering the second question before the first question. Gives me time to think. On Idlib, we have a preparedness plan that was done between the two teams in Syria and Ghazi Ain Tab. We are maintaining the plan as is. We're not assuming that the situation will go worse. We hope it will go for better, but we don't know. And therefore, we're maintaining that level of readiness just in case. Now, I hope, and I had a statement, that the agreement will yield easier humanitarian access. Access to Idlib comes from Turkey. We've requested that access to Idlib also comes from within Syria. The principle is quite easy. You need to reach people in need fast and efficient. If we can do that from within Syria, then we should do it without prejudice to any assistance that is coming cross border. So I think on Idlib, one will have to wait until the implementation steps of the agreement are crystallized more, because we don't know the details as of yet. In terms of needs, look, people, millions, are potentially food insecure. The health services are in need of continuous assistance, even though the government had maintained, and the international community in non-government controlled areas have maintained good levels of mitigating for major diseases and epidemics. It speaks to all of us, all services, that Syria has not seen an epidemic, has not seen a cholera, has not seen any of these serious illnesses. Even when we had a polio type 2 situation in Deir ez-Zor, which was the result of sort of a mutant vaccine, we were able to reach those children with WHO vaccines and UNICEF vaccines in the heart of the area that was then still under the authority of ISIS. So you have a food situation, you have a health situation, you have an education situation where you still have Syrian children in need of going to better schools, especially outside in the rural areas. In essence, also, you have to have a sense of resilience rebuilt in the Syrian entity, the personal Syrian who needs to be strengthened to stand on feet. And that comes under early recovery, which we try to do with lots of communities to enable them stand on their feet and fend for themselves. So all sectors actually are extremely important, whether it's food, nutrition, health, education, early recovery, protection, camp management in areas that are in the northeast and the northwest, where you have IDPs residing in many camps and require assistance. Anything and all things that have to do with women and young girls, quite important and quite pronounced, especially when people don't know exactly how to pursue their own affairs in terms of legal aid. And this is where we come in as well. I can't really put more emphasis, except if you want to go the Maslow way and say, you know, it's food and health, and then clothing, and then the rest. All things are important to a Syrian in need, and this is what we're trying to deliver.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Al-Za'tari. Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television, Lebanon. My question is regarding Al-Raqqa. We learned from recent reports that thousands of people have returned to Raqqa. How safe is it to return to Raqqa, and does the United Nations recommend that people return to an area littered with mines and explosions everywhere?
Yes, we have an estimation of more than 120,000 people who returned, civilians. Likewise, we don't encourage people to go back to Raqqa because of the UXOs and the ERWs that are there, quite dangerous. At the same time, there is a moral dilemma that we face, and we're facing with a duty-laden soul, in a way. We need to assist these people. So we do assist people who return to Raqqa through partners. We deliver food and health and other types of assistance. We've recently also authorized specific day missions to Raqqa city itself by the United Nations team operating from Hasaka and Qamishli. We've just had a WHO mission that went specifically to visit hospitals and check blood banks and medical facilities, and they came back with an okay report. So we have a moral obligation to assist people in the civilians in Raqqa. I hope that with the onset of an en masse office in Syria, work will double in terms of understanding the ERWs and the UXOs in Raqqa for a cleaning job that is still required in that city.
How about the situation in East Ghouta, also Rikban? I heard that some people have returned to Damascus, especially those who were badly wounded. Do you have an update on the situation East Aleppo, East Ghouta, and Rukban?
Most IDPs in from East Ghouta have returned to East Ghouta. They're not returning to five-star houses. The damage is quite considerable, but they select to go back. Life is picking up in so many ways. And of course, you're basically starting from a -2. So you need to build a lot of resilience in East Ghouta and assistance to move in. On Rukban, I've heard of some leaving. I don't have figures that I can be assured of. What we're trying to do is to take a convoy of humanitarian assistance to Rukban between the United Nations and the Red Crescent. And we're trying to get the approvals from all the parties concerned. I think the Rukban situation is untenable, unsustainable in terms of living, but there are 55,000 civilians in that camp that require assistance, and we need to reach them.
How about Yarmouk, and Yarmouk camp, refugee camp?
A rather difficult place to go back to, in my view.
Jennifer?
Jennifer Peltz from AP. Speaking of Idlib, have you seen any signs that people who may have left there in anticipation of a military operation are returning?
The movement in Idlib was within Idlib. Some people have, not in great numbers, but some people have, due to shelling and exchange of artillery, moved. But since the agreement, they have moved back. We have heard of a humanitarian corridor that was opened, but we have not seen a great number of people using that humanitarian corridor. I think everybody just felt at ease now with no military action over the horizon, so that they're staying there. Yeah.
Mr. Badi? Mr. Badi? You have your hand up? Yes.
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you, sir, for this briefing. My name is Abadi from the dossier. Refugee situation in Syria seems to be very complex. They are moving in and out within. Your office does the coordination. How much travel do you do within the country, and how, since there are many agencies reporting, who does the coordination?
I do sufficient travel to know what happens in the different governorates, but we have very efficient teams throughout Syria. The only 3 governorates where we don't have offices per se are Idlib, Dar'a, and Raqqa. But we have teams in the rest. We pay visits to Raqqa, as I explained earlier. I receive reports from all of our humanitarian teams inside these governorates, and the coordination is done by me and a humanitarian coordination team in Damascus. So we have a constant flow of data and information that come to us, and movements. The ability to assess is not bad, but it requires in certain cases an upgrade of personal access by technical UN staff. I'm not a nutritionist to understand I need my nutritionists and I need my educationalists to go and check and see, especially in areas in Daraa, some East Ghouta, where the access has been a little bit limited, and we're trying to get it to be improved.
Mario?
Thank you. Mario Villar with Agencia EFE from Spain. Where does OCHA stand in this growing debate on the reconstruction of Syria, and how does that mesh with the big needs that you have in the humanitarian aid department?
Well, I'm not OCHA, but I can speak for the UN coordination in Syria. We're not in reconstruction. I just hope to be able to be clear on that. The UN is not in reconstruction in Syria and will not be in reconstruction in Syria. We're not the specialists when it comes to reconstruction. So that myth about the UN and reconstruction needs to be resolved, in my view. Now, our main concern is a humanitarian assistance to people in need. We have a humanitarian response plan that has 3 objectives: saving lives, protection, and meeting the basic services and improving livelihoods of people. So if you go into a village and you see the 2-room school and the health clinic on the ground, and you put up a prefab as a clinic and a school, is this reconstruction or rehabilitation? Are you helping the community or reconstructing in that major sense? I tend to say that this is pure humanitarian work. You need to do that for people to be able to live. So we're into the humanitarian core function and not in any reconstruction, because immediately what jumps to mind, highways and high-rises and factories, etc. No, we're not there. We will not be there. Yes.
Just to follow up, if I can, is there a worry that money stops flowing to the humanitarian effort and goes to those other priorities?
There's always that risk, but it's mitigated through being clear on the data and the constant dialogue that we have with the donor community, which I think is quite positive and constructive.
Okay,
Thank you.
First in the back, you have Master.
Me? Is there a specific plan or a coordination for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon to go back to the safe areas in Syria?
Is there a specific
plan for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon to go back to safe areas in Syria?
We hear of the Syrian refugees returning from Lebanon, but it's not a UN operation, so we don't have a plan as the UN. As I said, a refugee crossing into Syria spontaneously or walking through and needing assistance, it is an obligation to provide that assistance. But we're not part of a plan to move refugees to Syria. I can't hear you.
Are you going to be part soon, or there's no plan for that in the meantime?
No, there are intensive discussions between UNHCR and the government of Syria with regard to the refugee situation and the returnees. I would refer you to UNHCR to ask these questions, because they do include legal clauses and agreements that are the norm in such instances.
Thank you, sir. Sir, earlier you had talked about the Palestinian refugees and that they're returning home. Do you have, from Aleppo and Homs, do you have an exact figure? How many have returned, or are they returning? Do you have any figure?
It's difficult for the refugees, the Palestinians, to return to Yarmouk or to Nairab or to camps because some of these camps have witnessed a lot of damage, a lot of destruction. So most of the Palestinian refugees inside are dispersed in, Syrian communities. You'll have to also remember that Yarmouk was not a camp in the sense of a camp. Yarmouk is a city, in a way, a bustling city, where Syrian and Palestinian lived next to each other. But now, after the fighting that took place, it's quite difficult for them to return to that area because it requires a lot of work, a lot of civilian work.
Enmity that has developed between these?
No. I'm not saying that at all.
They can't live together.
It's the inability to go back to an apartment that doesn't have, the living requirements, or maybe a torn down building. I mean, you cannot just go back into that. What I'm saying is that it will take quite a considerable time for Yarmouk to be equipped for people to live with, water, electricity, and there are some attempts to begin to do that, but they're not enough for everybody to come back to it.
Thank you. You made it clear that you mainly focus on humanitarian work, but I was wondering if I could get a reaction. Some prominent experts of international law sent a letter to the UN Secretary General and the European Union and some others warning that the funding for the reconstruction would actually help the human abuses if no safeguards are in place. And this call, the reconstruction call, has been also supported by Russia. Have you been assured any safeguards for the reconstruction? And if I could get a reaction to that. Thank you.
My simple answer is we're not in reconstruction. I mean, none of the projects that we have talks about reconstruction. You define reconstruction. Is it the UN rebuilding a dam or paving a highway or this is reconstruction. But if you're talking of UNICEF doing maintenance to a water pump that will feed 10, 15, 20,000 people, is this reconstruction? I think the issue of reconstruction for us is not an issue because we're not in it, and we cannot be in it. We're simply focusing on a set of objectives and activities targeting the humanitarian needs of the people. We're not in reconstruction per se. We're not going to rebuild cities in Syria. That is way above our head. And it's not our job to rebuild cities. But it's our job to work with the communities for them to feel safe, productive, able to drink good water and have some food on their tables. This is where we are. I'm aware of the letter, but I can assure you that we are not in any way in reconstruction or that we will ever be in reconstruction.
Last question is that?
You said that you can carry out assessment everywhere almost in Syria. Have you been to eastern Aleppo since it has been recaptured by the government? And how many people returned there? Also, are there any returnees coming from Jordan, from Al-Za'tari camp, where you have hundreds of thousands of people there?
I'm not aware of people returning from Al-Za'tari camp. And by the way, I'm not related to Al-Za'tari camp. It's same family name. I have not been to East Aleppo since after the incidents, but I know that at least 500,000 people returned to East Aleppo since then, and they have returned to some of their areas of living in East Aleppo and started living again, beginning to open shops, etc., etc. But it will take quite a long time before East Aleppo is revived as it used to be, if ever.
Is water and electricity provided? I mean, highways are they being repaired?
Yes, that's what we see.
By whom? By the United Nations?
No. It's these are government services, not us. No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Za'tari.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.